Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Shaun Attwood. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living, so you don't have to. So, Ghislaine Maxwell has been placed on suicide watch just days before she's about to have a trial or a court hearing, as she faces 5 criminal charges, one of which is for sex trafficking. And this is all happening right now in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. And I have to say, it caught my attention immediately. So in this video, I'm going to use some of my experience, some of my perspective. So I've assessed hundreds of prisoners. I used to work in a female prison for years, seen loads of cases of deliberate self-harm. I've even done some civil court cases where the families of prisoners who've committed suicide in prison have sued the prison. So I've assessed the level of care. And I have to say, this whole thing seems suspicious to me. It seems fishy. A lot of things don't add up. So I'm going to give you my clinical opinion on what those things are in this video. Plus at the end, to educate you, I'm going to tell you theoretically what would happen if Ghislaine Maxwell was actually suicidal. So how would it affect her trial? What would be done? What would be the next steps? Okay, let's step back and go into the details of this case. So at the time of this recording, her solicitors had just released a statement which said that yesterday Ghislaine Maxwell was sent to suicide watch without any psychiatric evaluation and without any good reason. And where she was placed on suicide watch, according to the solicitors, she doesn't have any access to legal documents, she's not allowed paper, she's not allowed pen, so she can't work on her arguments or on her side of the story that she's going to relay via her legal team to the judge. So I think the solicitors are suggesting that she's being kind of punished in a way. And remember, this is all in the backdrop of Epstein's suicide. Apparently, did that happen? Was that a suicide? Which happened nearby in Manhattan in a similar detention center. So that's probably in the context of everybody's mind when they're thinking about Ghislaine's risk of suicide. So the lawyers said that she's being punished and she's not able to prepare for a trial. Plus, critically, the lawyers said that they saw her this morning and she's not suicidal. She doesn't say she's suicidal. Apparently, this all happened because Ghislaine Maxwell emailed the Bureau of Prisons Inspector General Office saying that she feared for her safety. And they fed this back to the prison. And then shortly afterwards, she had an assessment with the prison psychologist and the warden. And they thought that her risk was so high, and I'll come back to what I think about that in a sec, so high that she had to be moved to the special housing unit. So she couldn't be cared for in the special housing unit, which is like a cell for an increased risk of suicide. People get an increased level of observation, etc., etc. They thought she was so risky that she couldn't even go there. She definitely couldn't stay in general population until her threats of being harmed and her fear for her safety is fully investigated. And apparently part of the problem was that when the prison psychology staff tried to assess her, Jalane refused to answer their questions. She just wouldn't cooperate. So they think that this all increases her risk and that she's in a high risk due to the fact that she's about to be sentenced for some very serious crimes. So she's at high risk of suicide. Okay, so that's all the background. Now let's get to the important schmuff. I'm going to tell you what I think. So again, this is the context of doing hundreds of these kinds of assessments for a living. Theoretically, Ghislaine Maxwell is at high risk of suicide. When you think about it, she is facing a huge sentence. She's on one of the charges is sex trafficking. It's really serious. She could be spending many, many years, if not life, in prison. On top of all of that, if she gets a prison sentence, which is very likely, she's going to be a massive target in prison. So if you watch other prison channels, you probably know that, especially in the States, sex offenders are like at the bottom of the hierarchy. They get attacked. Shaun Attwood talks about, shout out to Shaun, my boy, talks about his time in prison where people who did that nature of crimes would be KOS, they'll be kill on sight, so they'll be attacked regularly. And even though it's not quite as pronounced in the female prison estate, something similar will probably happen. So she's looking at a bad time in the future. But, and here's the important bit, I think her risk of suicide is far higher post-sentencing, depending on the outcome, depending on how many years she's facing. So if what the lawyers are saying is correct, that she's been motivated, engaged with them, talking about the arguments they're going to make, she's been part of that process, she's been talking to them, then I think it's very, very unlikely that she's suddenly suicidal. That doesn't make sense. Like, why would she be normal and high functioning 1 minute and then days later be suicidal? Because nothing's changed. Maybe after sentencing something might change, but at this moment in time, nothing has changed. Plus, and this is really also quite vital, she has never reported to her lawyers, either before or even very recently, that she's suicidal. So that does not make sense to me. The lawyers are on her side far more than the prison officers or the prison estate, who are, at best neutral, at worst are acting against her. The lawyers are the ones that will be able to convince the authorities to transfer her to hospital. So to me, it's just completely bizarre that she's supposedly suicidal, telling some prison staff but not telling her lawyers. I don't get that. I don't think it's possible, is what I'm saying. Okay, I'm going to look at another bit, which is, she said she apparently, reportedly, sent this email saying that she was fearing for her safety. What does that mean? How does that relate to a risk of suicide? Now, obviously, I've not had the benefit of assessing Jalane in person, but I'm still talking from my experience from my many other assessments. So what does that mean? She fears for her safety. First option, it could be the truth. We're not talking about mental illness here. She could actually be fearing for her safety. It could be that lots of other prisoners want to hurt her. She's very high profile. What she did was, as I said before, seen as this horrific, this horrible, lowest of the low kind of offence. Possibly the prison guards have got something against her. So she might actually genuinely be, for reasons that make sense, be fearing for her safety. At a stretch as possible, she's become psychotic. So when you have a state of psychosis, it's like a temporary period of mental illness, and typically you either hear voices or you have paranoid delusions. So fearing for your safety could, at a stretch, be that. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible. The reason I think it's unlikely is because when people become psychotic, it's usually in their late teens, early 20s for the first time, not at her age. What is she, 40s, 50s? Let me know in the comment section. Plus, if she was that psychotic, it would have been picked up by other people, including her lawyers. Another thing that I think's relevant is that she refused to engage with the psychology assessment. And I think this is a really stupid move on her behalf. And I'm assuming that it's because she's, quite entitled, she's quite narcissistic. I'm sure her attitude is, how dare they question my suicidality? How dare they call me mentally unwell? I will not dignify that with an answer. But she's actually shot herself in the foot by doing this because, they've put her on suicide watch because she didn't engage. And I think she has to understand that right now she's not the girlfriend or partner of a billionaire who has staff waiting on her hand and foot, who can sort of look down on people. Right now she's a prisoner. She's, she can easily be mistreated by the prison staff. She doesn't have any status or any authority. Were the prison staff punishing her? Are they sending her to suicide watch intentionally to kind of mess up her chances because they have so much hostility for her for offences? I don't know. Or because she wasn't cooperating. So they were like, all right, fine. If you're going to be like that, then see what happens when you mess with us. I've definitely seen that kind of behaviour in prison staff in my experience from when I've worked in prisons. Okay, so moving on. Another thing that I find remarkable is that they said that her risk of suicide is so high that she can't be housed in the special housing unit, which, as I explained, is an area where people who are high risk can be observed. So it's away from the main prison wing, more observation, more staff kind of proportions, stuff like that. I can't see how that makes sense. So again, I've assessed hundreds of these cases. She's actually, even though theoretically her situation puts her at quite a high risk, if you look at the other current factors, she's low risk. She's not actually committed any deliberate self-harm or made any direct threats to hurt herself. She's not been storing tablets for overdose. She's not cut herself. She doesn't have a history of self-harm. So when you take those into context, she's at best medium risk. And I would say actually she's quite low risk overall. So she absolutely can be handled in the prison estate and absolutely can be handled in the normal prison wing. And if not, then in the special housing unit. If I saw her, I would assess her, and if I was really worried about her, I'd send her to the equivalent of the special housing unit. We call it the healthcare unit in the UK. Right, so those are my thoughts on the whole case. Now I'm going to go a bit more broader and educate you on wider topics. I'm just going to turn this page that I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. So the next question is, how are people who are at risk of suicide or self-harm treated, dealt with, supported in prison? So there's loads of, unfortunately, the prison, self-harm in prison is really, really high. So it's estimated that about 5% of male prisoners self-harm every year, and about 20% of female prisoners self-harm every year. So that's really, really high proportions, especially in the women's estate. There's something like 90,000 male prisoners, a bit less than that, and something like 5% of that female prisoners. So if you just add the numbers up, we're talking about huge levels of self-harm. There's loads of systems in place. To summarise, there's something called the ACCT. We call it an ACT. So it's the Assessment and Care in Custody Treatment. Care in Custody. I've drawn a blank. So, sorry, somebody tell me what the T for ACCT stands for. I use it all the time, but I never say the whole thing out loud. I just call it an act. So apologies. So that's basically where somebody's identified as high risk of self-harm. So they are regularly followed up by staff. So psychologists, nurses check up on them on an almost daily basis. They have like a named prison officer that always look out for them. When they're moving along the prison, so when they're going to the gym or they're going to work or going to canteen, a prison officer follows them around, not like literally follows them, but keeps an eye on them, and they have this big orange act book and they write down any concerns so that it's passed on to the next member of staff so that the prisoner's mental state holistically and continuously and longitudinally is being assessed. So this is all to try and keep the prisoner safe in case they seem to be deteriorating. And if there's a high risk of suicide, as I said, they're transferred to the healthcare unit where there's doctors and nurses and they're kind of locked in a cell for most of the day. And items where they can self-harm are taken away, knives, obviously, razors, etc., etc. Okay, next bit. Just theoretically speaking, if Ghislaine Maxwell was suicidal, which I don't think she is, but if she was, what would happen? What would the next step in the procedure be? Well, the first thing, I'm talking about UK law here, the American law, the different terminologies, but it's roughly the same. So the first thing is the judge would have to decide whether she's fit to plead. So if she's saying a couple of days before a hearing that she's so unwell, so suicidal that she literally can't go through the trial process, then they might have to adjourn or retry her at a later date. And so this would be an independent forensic psychiatrist, such as myself, and another one. So you need two independent assessments. So just to instruct them, getting them to come in and see the prisoner, write up their reports, go through the medical notes, is a slow process. So we're talking about a few weeks minimum, sometimes several weeks. So it's a big deal. It's not something that's done lightly. I think that it's very unlikely that if somebody without a mental health history is just suddenly suicidal, that makes them unfit to plead, because they might be distressed, they might not want to engage in the trial, but more than likely they actually can cognitively go through the trial process. So they can enter a plea, guilty, not guilty, they can follow evidence, etc., etc. I think it's more likely that if anybody, Jalane, anybody, says suddenly that they're suicidal and there's no evidence to back this up, there's no history of self-harm, there's no actual suicide attempts, then if the judge thinks that they're putting it on, the judge might not even ask for a fitness to plea assessment. They just might hold them in contempt of court, as in they're intentionally choosing not to answer the questions, intentionally choosing not to engage. So not only will they be possibly found guilty for their original trials, but now they're facing another charge, possibly a longer prison sentence for contempt of court. So it is a bad idea, it's a bad look. If you're facing sex trafficking charges or murder charges, my advice to you is just make sure you plea. Okay, so to conclude, those are some of my thoughts about this case. It doesn't make sense to me. I've only got bits and pieces of information from news articles, but something smells fishy. The suicide risk assessment, in my eyes, doesn't seem to stack up. By the way, if you're interested in this kind of area, it's a little bit morbid, but I've got videos here of a real life case, I kid you not, I'm not making this up, of a patient I assessed who removed his own eyeballs in prison because he was psychotic. It's a good example of extreme deliberate self-harm in prison. I actually read an extract from that from my book. I'll put the link in the video. And although it's not quite the same, I've got a video about a woman, a fraudster, a con artist who made millions of pounds through various schemes, I believe faked mental illness to go through to get her trial dropped. So I believe that she faked being depressed so that she ended up being fit to plead. So it's not the same as Ghislaine Maxwell, but there's a couple of similarities, you know, depression versus suicide risk. Also, this woman was on bail. But anyway, it's an interesting story. Also reading it from an extract of my book. Go 𝐏𝐸𝐸𝐿𝐸, check it out. If you want something completely different, go check out my video on the psychoanalysis of Jimmy Savile. Right, that's all I have to say for now. Have a blessed day. Do not forget, I love you. Stay 𝐸𝐳𝐵𝐸. Peace.